Hello, everybody. This is Tyler FM, author of Glorybound, Tyranny of Stone, the first book in the Glorybound series. You can currently pick up your own copy at backerkit.com. I'll place a link to that in the description below. Today, I'm going to be reading you the first chapter of the book. I'll probably make 3 of these as a little sneak peek, and hopefully we'll get it all done in one take, but we'll see. So without further ado, Chapter 1, Solitude. The soft crackling of new flames, scarlet embers making their way into the night sky. Callan sat beside the campfire, sword propped against a nearby rock as he peered into the inviting glow. Tonight was his first night alone, away from the life he left behind. To his own solitary embarrassment, tears began to pool within his crystal-gray eyes as the reality sank into his heart. He was a young man, 20 years of age, a youth spent outdoors, leaving him with healthily tanned, freckled skin. He kept himself well groomed, with a smooth face and dirty blonde hair curling down to his shoulders, which were broadened by years of physical training. Callan left his home and his family behind, not because he was on the run from the law, nor did he leave for great wealth. He left only because of the aching in his soul. Tired of the state of the world, something did not seem right. Surely there was more to this life than what was set before him. He craved something more. Never quite able to put his longing into words, he only knew that he wanted to live as the heroes of old did. The ones you hear about in legends, when magic still sprang forth like steam from the geysers of Thessal, and the world was yet to be brought under the yoke of civilization. In those times, every breath was a new adventure. Callan saw his past within the flames, the day that changed him forever. When he was 11 years of age, he attended a coronation festival for Queen Olnetta, who now ruled over the land known as Gildaria, Callan's homeland. As the new queen passed by in her procession, Callan had hardly noticed. Instead, his eyes were pulled in by the mysterious figure beside her, a man of stature unlike any other. At least 2 heads taller than any human Callan had ever seen, he was almost as tall as the ogres who once lived in the southeast. He wore no shirt, exposing his freakishly bulky and scarred physique, and while he chose not to cover his torso, the man's visage was hidden behind a steel helmet. Stranger still was that he carried a large sword upon his back, appearing to be made entirely of stone. As the giant passed Callan in the street, the bizarre-looking man seemed to turn directly to him and peered into his soul. Callan was frozen in place, unable to move, his heart nearly beating out of his chest. Even now, the memory still sent a shiver down Callan's spine. 9 years had passed since this encounter with the strange man, but there wasn't a single day that Callan did not recall the event. He needed to know more, how to attain that kind of power, to strike fear with only a gaze. Was it possible, or was the stranger another breed of man entirely? Regardless, that experience was enough to change the trajectory of Callan's life forever, and lead him where he was now, alone. Originally, Callan had joined the garrison in the coastal city of Samil, Gildaria's capital and the place of his birth. After showing exceptional potential during his training, he was permitted to enroll in the military academy, where he studied for half a decade all the arts of war. Unfortunately, for a man of Callan's ambitions, the reality for a military academy graduate was less than ideal in times of peace. Instead of earning great victories in battle, he oversaw recruits in the garrison and aided logistics teams in transporting supplies between cities. This monotony had stolen a year of his youth. All the while, he tried his best to ignore the gnawing in his chest. Was this all that life was meant to be, or had man lost their way in the generations before him? He could not bear the idle contemplation any longer. With little regard for the rashness of his decision, Callan packed his bags and prepared to abandon his post. He left a note behind, saying goodbye to his parents and siblings, before slipping quietly out the door of their modest home and escaping the confines of city walls. Now he sat peering into the glittering flames as the tears ran down his face, knowing there was no turning back. Desertion of the royal army was punishable with imprisonment, so the likelihood of him ever seeing his family again was slim. But in his heart, Callan knew this was the only way forward. Callan spent half the night fixated on the comforting glow of his campfire, recounting his years before him and pondering what would become of his future. A life of adventure or of squalor. Only the gods knew now. Eventually, weariness took him, and he dozed off beside the fire in the open air, the 3 moons of Centrum watching over him as he slept. The sun rose early, as it always did on the eastern shore, and Callan awoke to the song of morning birds, taking in the blissful sight of dew on the early autumn grass. His eyes felt heavy, but he knew he must make his way further from the city. It would not be long before his parents and military superiors alike noticed his absence. Callan fastened his sword back to his hip, slung his bag over his shoulder, and kicked dirt over the smoldering embers of what used to be his campfire. Then he made his way out of the woods and back into the road heading west. He wasn't sure of where he was going, and could only pray that the path would be laid out before him. As the day drew by, he continued walking, his leather boots trudging across the dirt footpath. The Gildarian countryside was beautiful, sending him through lush forest, parting for clearings of lakes and large swaths of farmland. He passed through a few small farming towns, taking a rest at a public house for bread and refreshment when he could. He had packed smoked meat as his rations, but didn't want to consume it too quickly, lest he starve. So he thought that stopping at a pub when he got the chance would be best, even on his limited budget. Noon of the second day came, and fate took a turn for the worse. As Callan walked down a particularly narrow stretch of path, secluded and far from the view of any village, he saw something strange ahead. Recognizing it as someone unconscious in the road, he quickened his pace. It was a man, similar in age to himself, lying face down in the path. His shoulder-length brown hair was matted with sweat, but the shallow rise and fall of the man's torso told Callan that he was alive. Just then, a rustling came from the bushes. Up ahead, 2 men appeared, crossbows drawn, pointing directly at him. Callan was in shock. The sound of a twig snapping caused Callan to look over his shoulder, where another man stood holding an axe. Callan's heart began to race, pumping so strongly he felt lightheaded. He thought to reach for his sword, but it would be no use. Callan felt something press against his inner thigh. Looking down, he saw the man on the ground below him had awoken, or rather had never been unconscious. It was the tip of the ragged young man's short sword that Callan felt against his leg. A slip of the hand is all it would take to cleave his flesh deep enough to end in death. "Sorry, friend. I'm going to need that fancy sword of yours," the man below exclaimed. "The chainmail, too. And while you're at it, how about I take all of you?" The men crowding around him began to laugh amongst themselves at Callan's misfortune. Against any of these men in a fair fight, he certainly held the advantage, but all the skill of swordsmanship in Centrum would not be enough to save him in the face of the bandit's cleverly devised ambush. He racked his brain for a moment longer, desperately trying to think of what the heroes of times past would have done in his place, but in his panic, nothing came to mind. Callan grit his teeth, his knuckles white with frustration as the ringing in his ears took over. He unbuckled his belt and allowed his sword to drop to the ground. He removed his cloak and rucksack, dropping them as well. The smug man they used as bait made sure to grab the stolen goods before standing up, keeping his own sword drawn but no longer pointed at Callan. If need be, the archers would take care of him. "Here's how this'll work," the scruffy youth said sternly. "You're going to hop up on our horse and let us blindfold you. If you refuse, or try anything silly, we put a couple of bolts in your belly and leave you to bleed out. Understood?" As the ruffian spoke, he motioned behind Callan with the tip of his blade, showing an approaching man on horseback. This man was older than the rest, and bald except for the patchy gray beard. His horse, however, looked young and healthy. Speechless, Callan nodded and made his way to the animal, the old man helping him into the saddle before handing him a hempen bag to put over his own head. After Callan's hands were bound with rope, the men set off. Callan knew he was on the westward road just outside the village of Hefdell. Judging from the horse's movements, they took a turn north off the path and into the forest. Harder to keep track of was distance and time. The men took plenty of breaks, and their speed of travel seemed inconsistent. Was their behavior intentional to throw him off? Or perhaps these men were just that disorganized? Callan would have liked to take them for fools, but what would that mean for him? It felt like an age of staring at the canvas in front of his eyes. When the light struck just right, he could catch glimpses of green reflecting off the tree leaves. After some time, Callan's heart rate slowed, and his breathing returned to normal. Luckily, the sheer amount of stress dried his tears before they ever had a chance to fall. He didn't wish to suffer the embarrassment of crying on top of his already bad situation. As the adrenaline wore off, Callan used his clearer mind to try thinking of a way out of his predicament. He deduced that these men were likely slavers, considering they would snatch up just anybody off the street. There was little point in trying to ransom peasant farmers. Slavery was a practice outlawed in most of the kingdoms of man, but Callan had heard of a thriving slave economy in the land far to the southeast, in Uhea, the homeland of the ogres, once a forest of incomparable beauty, now a wasteland of ash. With the ogres having fled or perished with their home centuries ago, all the land held now was the criminal refuse of other nations, and men mad enough to go there voluntarily in a vain attempt to establish their own kingdoms. If Callan's assumption was true, then these were men accustomed to hardship and death, and they surely saw their fair share of combat. While true that Callan's training was far greater than that of some band of ruffians, he held no real combat experience. He had never killed a man, but today that would change. If he allowed them to return to their camp, there would undoubtedly be more waiting for him, and his chances of survival would be hopeless. Callan closed his eyes and listened carefully. 5 men, one sitting directly in front of him, but where were the other 4? He concentrated, listening to their voices as they carried on with their empty conversation. "Anyway, so then I told her that," one said, directly behind him. "Ah, there's no way you really—" A second one hollered, in front and to the left. It seemed 2 of them were on the verge of an argument, something about an encounter with a particularly feisty barmaid. The details eluded Callan, as all of his focus was spent on locating the last 2 of his captors. Finally, another voice spoke out. "You geezers are always finding something to be at each other's throats about," exclaimed the young man they used as bait, calling out from the front and to the right. Callan was running out of time. He would have to find the last of his captors in the heat of the moment. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding hard once more as he prepared for death, saying a silent prayer to any of the gods who would hear his plea. Something in his heart spoke to him to let him know that Ugamat, eldest of the great dragon gods, was watching. Suddenly, Callan ripped away the bag from his eyes. With an instant to react, he took a hold of the horse rider's sword, unsheathing it with the reverse grip before plunging it into the man's back. With a sharp gasp, the bald man's body tensed all at once. Callan yanked the blade from his body and leapt sideways off the horse. As he fell to the ground, Callan turned to look behind him, spotting the last of his captors. He was surrounded, the worst possible outcome. The two men following the horse gawked at the sight of their slain ally and readied their crossbows frantically. One man already had his crossbow in hand, the other drawing from his back. Callan rushed the man holding the crossbow, driving the already bloodied sword into his chest. With a wheeze, life slowly drained from his eyes. Callan kept the blade in the man's chest, turning sharply to the right and steering the dead man to use as a shield against the incoming bolt loosed by the archer beside him. Callan grabbed the dead man's crossbow and fired back, his bolt finding its mark in his assailant's throat. Choking on steel and blood, the second man fell to the ground. Halfway to freedom, Callan turned his view to the two remaining opponents. A black-haired man with a large scar across his face, and the long-haired boy who now wore Callan's sword on his belt. They both had their crossbows drawn and aimed right at him. Callan quickly dropped to the ground, letting go of the emptied crossbow as a bolt buzzed right over his head. Intuitively, he rolled to the left, hearing the snap of a bowstring and the thud of another bolt sticking in the mud beside him. He stood once more, using the sword that stuck out of the dead man's chest to cut the rope that bound his hands together. Callan grabbed the bloodied sword from the corpse, charging in close to close the distance between him and his captors. They drew their blades in turn, and the three of them clashed. As Callan had hoped, their swordsmanship was sloppy. 2-on-1 was undoubtedly dangerous, but winnable. The dark-haired man was clearly the more experienced of the two, as fear began to shine through the eyes of Callan's fellow youth. Callan kicked the long-haired ruffian in the chest, knocking him to the ground. Using this moment to face the scarred man alone, Callan fought aggressively, knocking his opponent's sword aside and running him through. Dripping with sweat, Callan pulled the sword once more from the dying man's body. The young man was climbing up from the ground, but upon the sight of the approaching Callan, he dropped to his knees and began to beg. "No, I'm sorry, please, he shouted in a panicked tone. "Your name," Callan said sternly, his gaze unwavering as his chest still heaved for air. He pointed the crimson tip of his blade against the youth's throat. Priam," the young man answered, tears welling up within his fearful eyes. "Priam, were you prepared to face death when you took up your sword?" Callan asked, casting a gaze of hatred down upon him. No, sir," Priam forced out, the tears now spilling as they began to stream down his cheeks. Callan saw the dread in Priam, and his heart was softened. It became clear how unequipped Priam was for this line of work. Callan dropped the stained sword at Priam's feet, bending over to reclaim his own sword instead. "For years I have dreamt what it would be like to kill a man with this sword. You took that from me," Callan explained with a certain coolness as he observed the shine of his own blade. Despite all the carnage the day had seen, it remained spotless. "I've spilt my first blood on a man's own sword, a terrible dishonor to us both." Callan began to think clearly once more, and started to worry about any other innocent people who may be caught up in the slaver's activities. He paced in thought, feeling the soft moss beneath his feet squish gently with every step. The close encounter with death and the loss of freedom already rendered him changed. "How many more await us at your camp?" Callan asked. 7, sir," Priam said shakily, wiping the tears on the back of his sleeve. "And how many more prisoners?" None, sir. We just sold them off last week," Priam said from the ground, looking up at Callan and not daring to make a move. Callan scoffed, knowing it was too late to save those who had already departed the shores of Proris. He turned quickly back to Priam, his voice picking up in intensity as he shot a gaze of fire through him. "Renounce this life, go home, become an honest man, and I shall let you live," Callan shouted. Priam nodded, standing up timidly. His knees trembled relentlessly, but the black cloud looming over his soul had begun to part. But Callan now pointed at the ground to the bloodied sword at his feet, then to the dark-haired man who still squirmed upon the ground, groaning as he bled out. "Prove it. Kill him," Callan spat. With trembling hands, Priam picked up the crimson sword and made his way to the man he once called a friend. He stood with sword overhead, hesitating for a moment before swinging down. Suddenly, however, the blade clashed with another, stopping in its tracks. Callan stood beside him, blocking the attempt to finish the man off despite his previous order. "No," Callan sighed. "It isn't right. No need to sully another man's innocence today." Walking forward with his own sword in hand, Callan plunged the tip into the wounded man's chest, watching his life fade away. I haven't got a home to run back to," Priam admitted. There was a silence that hung in the air between them. "May I follow you instead?" To Callan, Priam gave the impression of a lost dog. "To what end would you want to follow me? I'm nobody," Callan asked with the furrowed brow. "Clearly not, sir. You single-handedly killed 4 armed men, 5 if you count me, because I was a goner if you hadn't spared me. I owe you my life, so please." Priam dropped to the ground yet again, taking a knee and sticking the tip of his tarnished sword into the ground, bowing his head. Wiping off his own sword, Callan returned it to its sheath. "So be it." And there you go. Chapter 1 of Glorybound, Tyranny of Stone. Again, you can pick up your own copy at the link in the description below, and I hope to see you there. Until next time.